CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
What is going on, CFL fans? Regular season behind us, and it's on to the playoffs. Welcome to CFL 110. Andrew Paterson, Jeff Hamilton with you. We've got a very busy show today with some big stories both on and off the field. And great to have you all with us. Of course, CFL 110 all season long has been brought to you by our friends at Garage Living Winnipeg. And even though November and the playoffs are just around the corner, there's no slowing down for Pat and the gang at Garage Living. Seems there are lots of messy garages in and around Winnipeg and Manitoba. It's a big problem for some people. I was talking with Pat the other day. He was in a 5-year-old home in a new neighborhood, and the owners have never parked their car in the garage because it's so full of stuff. Garage Living Winnipeg can fix those problems and give you an organized garage with a place for everything. Don't miss your chance to clear the clutter, organize and beautify your garage with slat wall, polyaspartic floor coating, and made in Canada premium metal cabinetry. What you're going to want to do is get to their website. There's examples of the amazing work they've done for so many customers at garageliving.com, and give Pat Kanuga a call at 204-999-1234 to book a free in-garage consultation or make an appointment to meet him in their showroom at 981 Main Street. There's still time before winter. Give him a call. Garage Living Winnipeg. Garages made for living. All right. On with the show we go. And Hammer, listen, somewhat anticlimactic in a few of the games, not in the Bomber Alouette game. And we will certainly get to that and look ahead to the playoffs. But listen, probably the biggest story in and around the Canadian Football League this week, outside of Mother Nature popping in the final minute of that Bombers Als game, is the latest on CFL Commissioner of Randy Ambrosie. It was announced Saturday that the commission is going to be stepping down after this year's Grey Cup. For many, it was shocking to hear that Ambrosie, who'd taken over the role in 2017, I believe you actually broke that story, was leaving before many of the things that have defined his tenure remain unfinished. What was your reaction to the news and your thoughts on Ambrosie and his tenure and time leading the Canadian Football League?
I'll start by saying one thing. Maybe it was a misprint by me. 2017, Haas, definitely not 2007. He didn't wear out his welcome that much, but he did happen to wear out his welcome nonetheless. And you know, I thought the news was surprising. I don't think it's crazy that his tenure's done. I think the timing is interesting. Certainly before, a month before the Grey Cup game, when Randy Ambrosie will have to address all the reporters for his State of the Union. It just doesn't seem like it makes sense timeline-wise. I'm wondering if that has anything to do with Arash Madani, of course, who, while I was watching that Alouettes game in Montreal against the Bombers, he reported that the league, the board of directors, the CFL board of directors, board of governors, had voted 5-4 against Randy Ambrosie and stole a little bit of his retirement message too by saying that they were going to treat this as a retirement for Randy, as if he was choosing to leave. Doesn't sound like that's what happened. Sounds like Randy, overstayed his welcome, and now here we are to talk about his legacy. Personally, I think there's a lot of things that you can look at that are positive and quite a few things that you can look at that are negative. And I'll say this, it's not unique to Randy Ambrosie. That's the case for every commissioner, particularly in this league. It's very hard to leave your post as a celebrated man, as you have to go up and down of a league's roller coaster seasons and issues and all those things, and have to put out all these fires. Now, there's a few things that stick out to me, Huss, particularly when it comes to his legacy that aren't so great. Obviously, CFL 2.0, this was this global program that Randy Ambrosie ushered in, right away, thinking that he could get thinking that he could garner attention in other countries, other areas, bring players from other countries, right? From Germany, from Finland, first with Mexico. He had representatives from the Mexican League come down to Grey Cup all those years ago to announce this partnership, and how not only was it going to bring players from around the world to the CFL, it was going to open a pipeline for Canadian-born players to go and extend their careers in other leagues. And while it was a nice idea, I think it was met with from a lot of the media as in, what the hell are you talking about? I think the purpose was to create an interest in the CFL across the globe, if you will, and then turn that into TV deals. That never worked. Of course, I thought this was going to be his legacy, was expansion in the CFL. And despite honest attempts to get a team in Atlantic Canada and that brief, I don't know what you want to call it, flirtation or with the XFL to join the Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson led XFL, neither of those came to fruition. Neither of them got off the ground. The third thing that I speak to, and I think a lot of people were angered about or were angered by this story, was when Randy Ambrosie, during the early stages of the 2020 season and the COVID-19 pandemic raging, went and stood in front of a standing committee on finance, pleading to the federal government for $150 million, and then didn't have really any information to provide them when the politicians asked him questions, including why he didn't have any player representation. But I will, of all those things, Huss, I will remind viewers, since 2000, okay, only 3 commissioners have lasted longer than 3 years, and a guy that is viewed upon as being kind of, at least in recent memory, the best commissioner, the one that leaves, was Mark Cohen. And they actually are in and around the same time. Randy Ambrosie this is his 8th season. He won't last 8 full years as commissioner, but he will last parts of 8 seasons. And that's a pretty good run. It's a tough job. It's a thankless job. Yes, he misstepped a lot of the ways, but he's also behooved to 9 those board of governors, the ones that ousted him. They're the ones that, yes, approve his plan, each year, but have the power to change course, to tell him to do things. You know how many markets are in his ear on a weekly basis, telling him how to do his job? Every single one. And in a lot of ways, this job is a bit of a puppet role. You go in, you're a yes man, you can talk about how much you loved the league and love the players and all that, but you work for the owners. You work for the people in that room, and you do what they say. So those are the kind of the things that get lost in translation, in my opinion. I give him a lot of credit for his ability to navigate through the COVID-19 pandemic, something he never would have imagined having to do. You cannot question his passion for this league and love for this game. As a former O-lineman, he had all of that in spades. He was accessible to fans and to media alike. The issue for him, Huss, which I'll boil down this big long rant to, is that he just overpromised and underdelivered. And you can't do that in a role where people are constantly judging you by your actions. And that was the part that I think escaped Randy and all this, ultimately led to his demise here from the Board of Governors, was that he just never lived up to the expectations he set when he started.
Listen, it's important to mention too, kind of a big event that happened throughout the world during his time was the pandemic. And listen, they did lose a season, but I, like many people, was very worried about the entire survival of the Canadian Football League going through there. And yeah, I mean, the business of going to Ottawa, it probably wasn't well thought out and it was not well received. But I'll tell you what, they were far from the only entity in Canada that had their hands out to the government looking to get through a particular period of time that no one could have possibly planned for. And to be honest, I think, despite some particular problem spots in the country right now that have a lot to do with performance on the field and how those individual teams have been managed and run, The CFL, if you would have told me that we'd be sitting here in 2024 and this is the way the league would be looking right now, with the Bombers selling out all these games and BC coming back and, still some issues around it, I think we all would have taken it because there was a serious worry that this league might not exist. And I think a lot of the things that we've talked about, like the flirtations with the XFL and those sort of things, was born out of keeping Canadian football in this league going. And I have no doubt that Randy's intentions were always noble. I did appreciate the fact that as a former player, I think he was far more connected to the actual product on the field than a guy like Mark Cohan, who was a pretty slick businessman and, did pretty well in some press conferences or in talking to media. But I think he was pretty detached from the actual game itself. And Randy certainly wasn't that. So I'm not as down on him as maybe some others in the media. And listen, some people sort of make that their angle and they continue to do that. Listen, was it all great? No. But I mean, even the Global 2.0 plan that, did it garner enough business? Did it significantly change the revenue streams into the league? I haven't seen really much evidence of that. However, big picture, this has been a good thing for the Canadian Football League with the advent. I mean, right here in Winnipeg, Theodore Hansen has, a famous play in the Grey Cup that, will go down as part of Blue Bomber history. He was from the global program. We've seen all sorts of punters and kicking specialists, but it's beyond that as well. And, different markets have utilized that differently, but, having players, international players come in while maintaining the Canadian content in it, I think has been really good for the league, even if it maybe didn't boil down to the ultimate goal of increasing the dollars and cents for the league. So, listen, I think I'll look back at Randy Ambrosie's time here as one of probably the most challenging time in the history of the Canadian Football League, to be honest.
Easily.
There are a few others, but the pandemic was just exponentially more challenging than anything else. And, I think once we move forward, as much as his critics sometimes, like anything, the critics are often louder than a lot of the people that have supported somebody. I think we'll look back at it being, a relatively successful run and in a time committed for a guy that is, devoted a lot of his life to Canadian football, both as a player and then as a commissioner. Before we move on, because this is sort of fresh news, and I know we weren't really planning on it, but I'll just put this to you because you're pretty much in the know. Are we already starting to hear potential successors for Randy as the next commissioner of the CFL?
Obviously that's another natural thing to think about after this, to assess, the old guy's job and to kind of think about who the next guy could be and what they could bring to the table. There's a couple that I've kind of heard through the grapevine. I look at a guy like Mike Morreale, right? He's obviously has CFL roots. For some reason, it seems to be important that you're attached to Hamilton in some way or form positively. So that's a good advantage for him. And of course, his work with the CEBL, being a commissioner, right? He's a guy who appears to have a savvy business sense. He's got a nice smile. He knows how to kiss babies and say hello to people. He certainly makes you feel good when you get a chance to talk to him. I've had that opportunity a few times. I don't know, beyond that, what his assets are. I'm not saying he doesn't have value. I just don't know what that is. I've never spent enough time for him, but his name's certainly, out there. There's always this search whenever, when you look at the previous commissioners. Randy Ambrosie applied for the job when Jeffrey Orridge got it. Before that, he just didn't get it. So Jeffrey Orridge brought to them what they felt was the right package at the time, and that was to get in on some of these social issues, right? The LGBTQ plus communities, to make sure everybody, felt safe. Diversity is strength. All those kind of social issues. Randy was brought in to build the game and to get more eyeballs in the U.S., which I think he was able to do with the CBS deal and whatnot. A side positive for him, which I don't think was necessarily his agenda, was to get the ownership on there, so nobody's going to have to come in and try to strengthen the ownership. I think the ownership is as strong as it's ever been right now. So I'm curious to know what the Board of Governors believe, what they feel they need from their new commissioner. I imagine a lot of the same. Expansion will be on the docket. We've heard for years about the importance of adding a 10th team. Honestly, Huss, and I know this sounds kind of wild, and I don't mean to put this, as a little bit of an A-bomb to start off, I'm hearing more and more about U.S. expansion. And I'm wondering if a guy like Wally Buono wouldn't be interested in being the commissioner. Wally Buono has been saying on and on now, talking about the importance that the CFL gets to the U.S. And I'll tell you what, there's no coincidence in this league when you see a guy over and over again saying a message. I'm not saying Wally Buono's got is interested in it, but possibly could be a guy when you think about it. He certainly knows the league. He's been used as a consultant for several teams around the league. Seems to be the guy to call if you get into an issue. And I imagine he's helping a lot of the new ownerships. Owners kind of navigate the CFL. So I see him as a potential candidate. He might say no chance, no interest in doing that. I'm happy right now with what I'm doing and with my family. But those are kind of the names you think about. There's going to be candidates that come out. Even a guy like, and I'm not saying that he would be the guy, but a guy like Wade Miller might be interested in a job as commissioner.
Well, the job that he's done in Winnipeg speaks for itself.
Well, and that is
the envy of the Canadian Football League.
And if anybody knows how to get the job done, it's Wade Miller, right? I mean, he'll do it one way or another. So again, I put those names in the hat. I've been hearing a bit about Mike Morreale. The other two are just kind of names that I deduce from, I think would be good at the job, right? Would get the job done. I don't know if any of those three would be interested or will get the job. There will be other candidates, but you need to have, the reality is, and I wrote this column, I was actually reading it earlier today, back in 2017 when I broke the news about Ambrosie taking over for Jeffrey Orridge, is someone needs to come in there with some leverage. Someone needs to sign like a contract, have like a 3, 4, 5 year plan and sign a deal so that the owners can work with you, that the Board of Governors can work with you and not at the first glance of being upset and want to get rid of you, right? I'm not saying that was the case with Randy Ambrosie. Obviously, he lasted 7 years, but it's been the case in previous terms. So I don't know what exactly they want or who they want, but we'll figure that out here. It always seems to be whatever I don't want to say flavor of the month is, but it's someone who sees we need to move into the future. And right now, I hear a lot of whispers about growing the game, growing the league.
Yeah, and just one more thing on expansion. And listen, I would have loved, this league would be so much better with a 10th team. And if it could truly be a coast-to-coast league, the geography of Canada isn't like most other countries, and there's incredible challenges economically and travel-wise, but it would have been great. But it just seems like they've worked so hard, and it just hasn't happened. I do wonder at what point they switch the focus of a 10th team from Atlantic Canada to Quebec City. You look at the popularity of football in Quebec, the strength of their university programs, how the Alouettes have rebounded. And I really do think that would be a great route to start putting some more effort and resources into potentially seeing if that could happen. And because of that, I do wonder if there might be a want for someone with more Quebec ties to potentially being involved in that chair. There's not someone off the top of my head, but if I'm in ownership and I'm thinking that would be great for the league, that certainly would be something that I think would be advantageous for the next commissioner. Needless to say, this is going to be a big story when we're in Vancouver in a couple weeks talking about the big game, but also the future of the league. Randy Ambrosie finishing up, stepping down, and moving on. To the games we go, and coming out of the last week of the season, there was a few games that didn't have major impact on what was going to be happening in the playoffs, and the Edmonton-Toronto game was one of them. That being said, it was a pretty good one. It goes to OT, but it ends on a walk-off rouge on a punt through the end zone. This is different than the missed field goal. The rules are very clear, and it's pretty simple, and it's logic. If you just need 1 point to win the game, go ahead and do it. Whenever this happens, there's lots of talk about it on both sides of it. Where are you at on this latest walk-off rouge in the CFL?
So I was thinking of recapping where I've been at. So I hated ties. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't a huge fan of the missed field goal, but win with a rouge. I do think I definitely have room for the argument to get rid of that, whether that entirely, you get a point off a missed field goal, or maybe within the last 3 minutes of each half and overtime. I'm definitely interested in that. But I love this one, man. I absolutely love it. Like, to me, this is strategy. This is football. This wasn't just a team that managed to get to their own 30-yard line and boom, a punt randomly and win the game. This was a team that was using their personnel, Jarius Jackson in this case, head coach of the Elks, using their personnel perfectly. They had an opportunity to win with 1 point in that overtime session after the Toronto Argonauts missed their 49-yard field goal attempt, which was pushed back to 49 yards after a penalty. So they put themselves in that more difficult kicking situation. And then credit to Javon Leake, who then returned the ball out of the end zone to give the Elks the opportunity to win by 1 point. And then facing what I believe was a 41-yard field goal, which many might look around and go, 41-yard field goal? Come on, that's a chip shot for veteran kickers. That's a no-doubter or whatever. Well, it was a rookie kicker playing his first CFL game who had already missed one of 2 converts, and I believe his only field goal made, his name's Vincent something, I forget, I should know that. The only field goal he made, I believe, in that game was from 19 yards out. Now, it would be nice to give this kid an opportunity to win a game and, tell his buddies how he was drafted in May and was carried off the field with his teammates. This guy had nothing to do with this season. Jake Julian, on the other hand, had played all season long and set a single season record for the longest highest punting average in CFL history at something like 56 yards, which I believe, or 54 yards, one of those two, which I believe was the distance in which he needed to hit. That's the average. This guy has pummeled an 87-yarder earlier in the season. And like I said, set a new record, beat John Ryan's record, I believe, from 2005 in Winnipeg. So that's the guy you want to put the ball into his hands, and he executed it perfectly. And the Elks, while they finish another playoff-less season, at least finish on a high note in what was a truly Canadian way to win a game. Where are you at? You gotta enjoy this too. No, are we agreeing? Are we disagreeing?
Yeah,
on this?
Listen, I haven't been bent at any point about the Rouges. I am a CFL fan. I know what the rules are, and I roll with them. And I'm not here banging the drum to change them. The way you rolled it out was perfect, because this doesn't happen unless you're in a situation where you only have to score 1 point. And the fact of the matter is, the way that overtime is laid out in the Canadian Football League, that unless you get sacked, unless you take penalties, you're pretty much in a situation where even if you miss the field goal with any sort of a competent kicker with half a decent leg, you'll have the opportunity to get that single point and at least give yourself a chance to live to see another day if the kick is not made. The Argos have only themselves to blame. And listen, if this was an impactful game, maybe they handle things differently. But the bottom line is, the Elks were put in a situation where they just needed 1 point. And if you think that you've got a better chance of getting that point by doing a punt than doing a kick based on the CFL rules, then do it. As I say, to me, there's always some people, the league's a joke or whatever. You know what? It's just different. And this is the way that it is. It is a unique quirk of Canadian football. It has always been that way. And I, for one, am not banging on the drum to change it at all. Listen, if a championship game was decided that way, maybe there's a little bit more time for it. But, I mean, I'm not losing any sleep over a nothing game in week 21 of the regular season that ended in that fashion. I'm ready to move on to the playoffs. But the Elks aren't going to the playoffs. They're moving on to the offseason. And outgoing Elks president Rick Lashire is zeroing in on a new president, and they hope to hire a GM and a head coach soon after, preferably by the Grey Cup. It is interesting timing, Hammer, when a lot of teams usually use the Grey Cup as an opportunity to gauge interest or talk to provincial hires. What are you hearing, and what do you make of the Elks' decisions to make, knowing that there's a lot of people in that building that are still connected to Chris Jones? You've got a brand new owner, and bottom line is this team needs to regain the respect of their community, and many people would say, regardless of the fact that the team did turn it around and was certainly a lot more competitive after that another brutal 0-7 start, that it's time to change things up. I mean, what's the latest on Edmonton, and how do you see this going?
Well, Sure made sure to note that he was going to do it the right way, the traditional way. As a guy who was a president with the Elks, years ago, was in the same role with the BC Lions, so he knows how this process goes. Get the president in, have the president decide who's going to be the general manager, and have the general manager decide who is going to be his head coach, and so on and so forth. The last thing you want to do is commit to a head coach, go look for a GM. Meanwhile, you're looking for a president. That's not what they're doing, obviously. So get the president in. I have to imagine that's going to be fairly soon. I am curious about the timeline now. I should say that their hope was to get things done by Grey Cup, which means they have a goal by Grey Cup to have all those, definitely have the president, but have all three of those positions filled. I do find it interesting, as you mentioned, Huss, the Grey Cup is usually an opportunity to kind of test the waters, look at potential suitors, gauge interest from men that may be involved in the Grey Cup game but aren't able to entertain any kind of talks or conversations, of course, as they get ready for the biggest game of their season. It just seems odd to me, and it suggests that they'll probably go back with the same group, the interims, make them full on, give them the job. I read somewhere it said permanent, but no job in this league is permanent. But to get rid of that interim tag, that's potentially going to happen here, and I don't see it as a coincidence, Huss, that this week you have Geroy Simon. Now it aligns with the season closing, so it's not like he called his own presser, but he talks about how Trey Ford he believes Trey Ford is a quarterback that can win the Grey Cup. That's quite the shift from the last couple of seasons when you've actively, particularly last year, went out and found somebody to replace him. How that trust is suddenly in the pocket of Geroy Simon.
Just
is an
devil's
advocate
on that. Devil's advocate on that, though.
Shoot.
What would the benefit be of saying, I don't know? I mean, at least it leaves your options open. He hears what at least he hears want to say. He would like to hear.
Yeah, no, you're fair. Very fair point. Very fair and valid point. I mean, I guess we'd hope that they'd be honest, so we're assuming that they are being that, but we'll see. I just think it's interesting. It's Larry Thompson's or the president's job, or both of them together, to decide if what they saw down the stretch. I believe they wrapped up 5-4. I believe it was over 500 down the stretch there in their last X amount of games where they finally got things turned around. But is that going to be enough? And I do think Trey Ford, whether Geroy Simon believes in him or not, is going to be a major part of this. Personally, I know there's a lot of people that are saying Trey Ford needs to be the guy, that he needs to get his opportunity, that he's done enough over the last couple seasons or 3 seasons or whatever, that he's been able to be the winningest quarterback on an otherwise crummy team. I think that's a big decision to be made. And I'm wondering if they're looking for a GM with a plan or a GM with a plan for Trey Ford. And that will be very telling in contract negotiations, because as the sounds of it right now, unless they can ink Trey Ford to a new deal, and why Trey Ford would sign a new deal, before knowing who his GM or his head coach is or whatever, that's all got to be taken care of first, and that will be taken care of. But there's a lot of decisions for them, Huss. I don't look at their last final stretch, much like I don't look at Hamilton's, final 7-8 games or whatever of the season and look and think that that's going to translate to 2025. These teams were put in seriously tough situations for their losing early on and were forced to have their backs against the wall, arguably in the dog days of the season. And so I think a lot of that success was born out of desperation and less about turnaround or better coaching or all those other things. And those are the things that the president, of course, the GM and head coach are going to have to think about when making decisions on who they put on the field.
Yeah, the whole thing with Trey Ford's fascinating because, listen, I think he's very talented and I think he's got a bright future in the CFL. I'm not sure that there's let's just say things don't work out in Edmonton or he feels like doesn't want to be there. I don't know that we can say unequivocally that there's another team in this league that's going to be throwing down the check and saying, you're our guy and you're the starting quarterback. I really think that regardless of whether he's in Edmonton next year, or probably less so in Edmonton, to be honest, based on all of this than elsewhere, will he have the path to being the starting quarterback without earning it and having some significant competition. So, to me, we're going to have one of Vernon Adams. Well, it's not going to be Nathan Rourke. Vernon Adams is likely going to be available elsewhere. I'll say this. If I'm the new owner or the new president, and I want this team to be good and competitive right out of the gate, I'm making a phone call to the BC Lions to see, can we make something happen and have VA there? I'm sure BC would love to have him in the East and not have to deal with him as much as they would be there. But again, there's only so many guys and there's only so many chairs. So it really is fascinating. The one thing that I keep coming back to, and I do tons of work with Dustin Nielsen and the guys in Edmonton with Edmonton Sports Talk through the Lock Shop and everything, I do wonder what the appetite with Elks fans would be to come back with the have the guys in those jobs done enough as interim coach and GM to give that organization the confidence that things are going to be significantly different next year? I don't have the answer to that, but I think it's a question that the organization absolutely has to ask themselves, because I don't know how many more chances they're going to get. The stench of the Chris Jones era still lingers, and the aftermath is happening right now. And fairly or unfairly, Jarius Jackson and the rest of those guys kind of came in under that. And I think there's definitely a powerful argument that a completely clean slate with some people with experience in the Canadian Football League making a team that'll look very different next year, something that's in the best interest of the franchise.
The advantage, of course, of keeping the guys that are there, and I think Jarius Jackson is a good coach. On the Trey Ford side, he was also the offensive coordinator, so it wasn't like he wasn't making decisions, right? So that will be an interesting part of Trey Ford's decision-making process, is whether he believes in Jarius Jackson as a head coach, whether he believes he's going to get the opportunity with him. Geroy Simon, we talked about this before. When Chris Jones got fired, it was almost as if when he was taking questions, it was as if the reporters weren't kind of taking into consideration that Geroy Simon was making a lot of the decisions during the season and was kind of hand in hand with Chris Jones. So I'm with you. I wrote about it. I think you do need to get rid of that stench, but I think you need to be careful as well. This organization went through this whole, rebuild idea, right? They had Scott Milanovich for the 2020 season, then he was gone, and then Chris Jones came in, right? It was all these things that existed in and around kind of like that, these organizations for that were moving pieces. So I know it's a new ownership group and there's going to be new people handling this, but you got to be careful with starting from scratch. And I go back to my original point, Huss, if you have 2 weeks now to Grey Cup, couple weeks now, are you going to make all those decisions? You have to assume that people have been thinking about head coach and general manager, and I imagine the president in their interviews have shared their plan. But presidents aren't people that necessarily bring in GMs and head coaches or have depending on who they are. So it's really, there's so many moving pieces above the head coach right now, that and even the GM with the president and what's going on, that I don't know, but I'm with you. I think, I wonder what the fan base feels like. I know the fan base was buzzing there at the end of the season, and Chris Jones technically isn't here any longer, so that era can end. You can talk about this being a new era under different people. It's just a much harder sell to do that. But at the same time, Huss, I'm thinking, as I'm speaking, who are other candidates that might be able to come in and show the way for them? And I don't have a long list of guys. And so I just look at the timeline, Huss, and I think they're coming back. I really, and at this case, if they want to get things wrapped up by Grey Cup, I feel their only opportunity to do that, to take care of that business, is to tell those guys who have been working, and I imagine are still working, that they'll have another year. The issue with it, Huss, is what do you give them? Well, you give them, you can't tell them, hey guys, we're gonna give you a prove me wrong contract and I'll give you a year as lame ducks, because you make a guy a lame duck, they start making calls like they're lame ducks, like they're fighting for their jobs and not the necessarily long-term health of the organization.
Although the funny thing is the long-term health of the organization might depend on the short-term health of the football team, which is a unique situation. And just before we move on, Stephen Jennings jumped in the chat and said Trey Ford should come to Winnipeg as the backup, learn from 8 for a season, and then take over. We won't get into this right now, but Zach Collaros has 1 year left on his contract. The Bombers are hosting the Grey Cup. That whole quarterback conversation when we're talking about Winnipeg that's been so good for long. I don't think that Zach is, I could be wrong, but I think the plan was always to finish up next year as a Winnipeg Blue Bomber, and that would probably be it. So that secondary quarterback position, it does open up some intriguing possibilities here in Winnipeg. And certainly Wade Miller and Kyle Walters and Mike O'Shea are going to be thinking about that in the offseason. But
they have the O-line, and we talked about this on a couple shows ago, Huss, the Ford twins are interested in signing together. So I am with you. I believe that Zach's final years probably is next season. So that would align. I just wonder how Trey Ford's patience might be.
Well, no, it's a great point. Careers are short. And, if you can, know that you're going to be a starter or have a legitimate chance to be a starter, that probably looks a lot better than coming in and knowing you're going to be a backup for a year before you get that chance.
Here's the other thing, Huss. I think that I know we spent a lot of time on the Elks, but Trey Ford, we talked about this a couple episodes ago. The knock against Trey Ford is how he lacks the command of a huddle. He doesn't go in there with this driving confidence, and then when he breaks the huddle, isn't coaching up his receivers and other people and is active. He's quietly addressing the play, giving it, and then breaking, and then worrying about his own stuff, which is not what a veteran quarterback does in this league. And that is the number one reason for why people are reluctant to make him their number one. So a year under Zach Collaros might do wonders
in the bomber
for
culture as well.
And behind an O-line where he can actually go through his reads, right? Edmonton had a good O-line. So it wasn't like they were bad at protecting him per se, but the Winnipeg, that's the bread and butter of their team. The more and more I think about that, I think it could be a great idea, because I do think that Trey Ford could definitely benefit from some more active teaching and seasoning. As you mentioned, no better place than the Winnipeg quarterback.
Hey, before we get to aftermath of the Bombers Owls in the playoffs, of course, staying in Alberta, first time in forever, both teams are out of the playoffs. And Stamps president Jay McNeil threw his full support behind Dave Dickenson this week, saying he plans to have the GM and head coach back in 2025, was not as committed to the other coaches. And just in the last few hours before we went live today, the Stamps announced that special teams coordinator and assistant head coach Mark Callam out, defensive coordinator Brett Monson gone, defensive line coach Jawan Simpson. They continue to say further announcements regarding the football operations staff will be made at a later date. Some changes were coming, but I'll be honest, I'm a little surprised that something hasn't happened with Dave Dickenson, whether it's just be the head coach, just be the GM. What do you make of what we've learned in the past week from Calgary and where this team moves forward after an incredibly disappointing year?
I'm surprised by the moves. I shouldn't be surprised by the moves. I mean, from what we've been hearing from the Stampeders locker room, not just this year, but for the last 2 seasons, you knew change was coming. They squeaked into the playoffs last year at 6-12. They were absolutely garbage this season. They had a lack of discipline, a lack of effort, a lack of maturity. All of these things they lacked, and it cost them big time. And you look at, particularly Mark Killam, who is the assistant head coach and the special teams coordinator, and a guy that many pundits across the league for years have been suggesting is worthy of leading a team as a head coach. The fact that he's gone, well, I guess Dave Dickinson at the very least isn't going to be shedding his head coaching title for Mark Killam. Whether or not he sheds his head coaching title, I guess that will remain to be seen. That those decisions haven't been made. I'm not surprised that Dave Dickinson kept his job. Dave Dickinson has been the face, or one of the faces, of the Calgary Stampeders organization for a very long time. He was a big part of all their successful years. Of course, obviously, as offensive coordinator and head coach, they just haven't been good since 2018, Huss. They really haven't. That coincides, obviously, with the departure or not the departure actually of Bo Levi Mitchell, but the decline in his game and eventual departure. I just think this is a message from Calgary ownership that's and I mean, I don't know this to be true, but this is what it feels like, is that, here, Dave, you've been around for a long time. You're a good football mind. Fix this mess. I don't think the ownership wants to get rid of everybody, because then they have to start searching for the same situation that the Edmonton Elks are in. They don't want to do that. And I do believe Dave Dickinson deserves another chance to get this right. Whether or not Dave Dickinson will be able to is a whole other question. I'm just very curious on how he rounds out his staff, if he makes himself just the GM, or if he takes over the head coaching duties, because he's got a lot of spots to fill now, and he's got to fill them sooner than later to get a head start on next season. So whether or not he's walking the plank here and saying that this is your last season to get it right, I don't know that. We'll see. It's probably getting pretty thin, but at this point, I just see it's an easier move to send a message to the coaching staff. I wonder how much input came from the players. It's usually not a lot of player input in the CFL when it comes to coaching, but when we hear guys like Rene Paredes talk about how this team's been in a decline since the 2018 season, and while he didn't call the last 2 years embarrassing, he did mention that he was getting calls from alumni of those years when they were doing well, and before that, I imagine, wondering what the hell is going on. That's a massive indictment against an organization that used to be the belle of the ball not so many years ago. So I think, again, Dave Dickinson deserves another chance here, but this feels like a final chance after 2 miserable seasons in Countdown.
Yeah, and I mean, the worst thing about this year is it started off not very well and just continued to get worse. And I mean, that is so far away from the standard that we've been used to seeing the Calgary Stampeders at for the last better part of 20 seasons. But there is something to be said for some erosion over the last number of years that has put them in a very unfamiliar position, being at home watching the CFL playoffs on television. Before we get to the playoffs, we have to bring up the Bombers and Alouettes. We got to all the newsy things first. I was so excited for this show because I was traveling on Monday and I wasn't able to talk to you on Winnipeg Sports Talk about it. And we usually try and go around the league and not focus in on the Bombers, but let's do it right now. Was this an act of God that put the Bombers into the West Final? I can't say how big of a play it was. I watched it again last night on the TSN2 replay, and it was as crazy watching it again as it was listening to it on the road from DB and Doug Brown and Derek Taylor, which was incredible as well. I mean, you were there. For folks that have heard about this or maybe weren't watching us, take us through the final 30 seconds of that football game and how the football gods smiled upon the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, much to the chagrin of the Saskatchewan Roughriders.
Look, I'm extremely grateful to work at the Winnipeg Free Press, a paper that still invests in traveling, including the Canadian Football League, the only English newspaper in the entire country that still sends me to games. And I was feeling incredibly fortunate to be in my seat for that game. Huss, let's take you down to what was it left. I mean, let's go to the 61-yarder from Castillo first. After the Bombers decided to trot him out for a 61-yarder that had really no wind. I mean, to be clear, there was a swirling wind all game. You could see the flags at the press box. You look across the field and the stands, there's red flags above them, and half of them were going one way and half of them were going the other pretty much all game, but not necessarily like heavy, right? It was just a weird swirling wind that both kickers understood and knew about. And so when they failed that one, I'm like, okay, this game's getting over. There's no way that they're going to get another shot at this. I don't know why they would risk it in a 61-yarder. It felt like 2016 BC playoffs where they trotted out Medlock for that big kick and it didn't pan out. Obviously, the stakes weren't the same. However, I'm ready to carve them up for blowing what was an incredible opportunity to finish first in the West against an Alouettes team that, had a fair amount of starters in, but weren't playing for anything in the standings, right? And hadn't played their best football for the month. Anyways, fast forward to this moment where the defense has forced a 2-and-out, and suddenly the Bombers are going to get an opportunity to get the ball back with 20 seconds remain. I'll say this, Huss, because it's all about timing. Jason Moss calls a timeout at the end of the clock just so he can get down to the exact second of wasting the clock, which bought enough time. And at this point, I'm getting ready to carve up the Bombers, being again like what a miserable game for them. They looked uninspired in the first half. They kind of figured things out in the second half, but here they are about to fall short to a team that's playing for nothing, to a team that beat them in the Grey Cup last year. And I look to my left, and there is, and I'll use the words of Zach Collares, it looks like it's out of a scene out of Wizard of Oz, where I see, and like if you're at the press box, there's still like suites and stuff that go all the way down. So it's kind of like I'm at midfield, and the boxes kind of go towards the corner of the stadium, and then there's a big wide open. They don't have any seats on the end zones and stuff. So I see this tornado of leaves come around the corner and is suddenly littering the field with leaves. And I pull my phone out because I'm like, are you guys seeing this? And I'm looking across the press box. We have it's a pretty cool press box. It's like garage doors that close. They're open, so we're witnessing all this. I whip my phone out to take a video, and I'm looking at my video. I'm like, this isn't doing justice. You know, like the Northern Lights, when you go out and see Northern Lights and you don't see anything in your phone, you take a picture and then your phone develops and you're like, yeah, those are sick Northern Lights. Well, it was the opposite effect. I could see this craziness happening in front of me, but it wouldn't capture on my video. I put my phone down slightly disappointed, and in that time of disappointment, the black clouds that were once in the distance, far distance, are now immediately over top Molson Stadium, and the wind that was swirling all the time is now fiercely going in one direction against Joseph Zima and his punt. And on top of it, we get a heavy rain. There's like a bit of sleet or hail that comes into play for just that amount of time. Joseph Zima obviously shanks his punt, goes out of bounds at the 44-yard line. We're all looking at each other in the press box like, is this actually happening right now? There's 10 seconds left on the clock or 20 seconds left on the clock, whatever it is. They run one play, and in that time where they run the play, Huss, I'm not even kidding you, it was still raining. It was still incredibly windy. But those flags I was talking to you about on the opposite side of the field were no longer competing with each other. They were ripping one way, and it was to the back of Sergio Castillo for what was a 51-yard field goal win. And it's just like, how does this happen? Credit to, like, you know, it wasn't ideal conditions still, but the the win that was such a factor throughout the game was now a friend of Sergio Castillo, and he booted it right through the middle, and the Bombers won what was an incredibly improbable game to clinch the West Division.
You know what? And as I said, I was down south and I was listening to the game. You know, we were in Vegas, and normally, earlier in the year, I'd been down there, no problem getting the CFL game on. But the fact that it was on the Saturday, right in the middle of a massive college football slate, it was tough. So I threw beyond. I was listening to the guys. I'm going through this, and I anyone following the Bombers, I cannot believe they missed this, and what a missed opportunity. And then I'm thinking about, my God, they're going to have to play next week in BC now with Vernon Adams. And I mean, hearing, and Derek was the same way. He first described it, he goes, they must have just done the 50-50 because there's all the 50 tickets. It kind of looked like that. But it was the leaves. And then watching it in its entirety last night, I mean, it just truly is incredible. And as Dwayne Ford said, we now know that God is a Bombers fan. Nobody in Winnipeg said that for 29 years when they hadn't won a Grey Cup.
Hey, Huss, do you think this is going to help the narrative of fans, whether they're in Winnipeg or outside, that feel that Winnipeg get all the breaks?
Yeah, well, let me guess. I don't think we need any tinfoil hat people saying that Wade Miller is controlling the weather in the Canadian Football League. I've got a lot of time for other conversations, but let's stop at anybody has control over weather, please. We're going to see some weather this weekend. We got Toronto and Ottawa going at it in the East semi. This, to me, is the Argos to lose. Ottawa, was getting killed by them 2 weeks ago in that final matchup that still could have potentially put that game in Ottawa. They came back. It was a little closer by the score, but this is Toronto. I still actually sort of feel like Toronto, despite what we saw from Montreal in that last game, might be the most likely team to be playing in the Grey Cup, to be perfectly honest. But to me, I would be absolutely stunned if it is not Montreal and Toronto in a rematch in the East final. What sort of chances are you giving to Ottawa, and what would need to happen for Ottawa to win this football game?
I feel better about Ottawa than I did last week. I know a victory over Hamilton isn't necessarily going to be a major boost of confidence, but Hamilton has been playing well even after they were eliminated. They didn't quit, right? Bo Levi Mitchell has been advocating for his MOP, and he wanted to make sure that he had a good, solid final game of the season. I feel better. I don't feel great. That's for sure. I don't feel like the Ottawa Red Blacks are somehow going to or have done anything over the last 6 weeks or so that suggests that they're going to be a favorite or win this game. That being said, it's the playoffs, man. Any given Saturday.
CFL.
It's the CFL. We saw Chad Kelly choke in the playoffs last year. Now, there were some other things, obviously, that were brewing in that organization that led to that performance, I imagine. But, that's the last time he took the field for a playoff game. So, I mean, there's a lot of, you ask the question, what's it going to take for the Ottawa Red Blacks to win this one? It's going to take, as I mentioned, and I've mentioned several times in previous shows, it's going to take a dominant performance from Drew Brown. I think Drew Brown is capable, I really do, of having a dominant game, but he is going to need a perfect game to beat this team, to make up for some of the other, glaring issues on this team, right? We talked about the loss of Darius Pickett and the impact it's had on this defense. That's a significant loss, and it's one that they haven't really been able to recover from. Special teams, they need to win the special teams battle. They need to limit Janarian Grant. We know how good Janarian Grant seems to get when it's playoffs. Anyone who's watched him in Winnipeg knows as much. So they got to limit him there and win the field position. And when you put all those things together, the Argos have to do all those things too, but they've been proving that they can do that over the last month or so. As you mentioned, to me, it's I'm with you. It's Toronto's game to lose, but I do think it will be a closer game than the West.
Yeah, well, listen, I'll just say this. If we're sitting here in a week talking about Ottawa going to Montreal, I'll be incredibly happy for Bobby Dice. I'll be happy for Drew Brown as well, because I think it's implied in that he will have a big game. And I think we'll also be talking about what the hell happened to Chad Kelly in a big high-leverage game like happened last year.
Exactly.
I don't expect to be having that conversation. I do think the Argos win this game. But now we get into BC and Saskatchewan. And I'm looking forward to talking to Jamie Nye tomorrow on Winnipeg Sports Talk, because I am fascinating. I cannot wait to hear the Saskatchewan perspective on what we just talked about what happened at the end of that Bomber Alouette game, because it did significantly change what the Riders were planning on doing in a game where, I mean, they would have been a massive favorite if it was a game that they had to play in. And that was the situation that they were looking at. But I can't help but think about our conversation last week on this show about how different the BC Lions looked and played with Vernon Adams leading the way. It was, 2 weeks ago, they were in Saskatchewan and got their asses handed to them, losing by 31. They looked nothing of the sorts in the following game with Vernon Adams. So now they've got a chance to go in and, compete against a very good Saskatchewan team. I give Saskatchewan the nod based on the defensive side of the football. I think Saskatchewan has a championship-level defense. I think they've got a very competent quarterback in Trevor Harris, and I think they've got a great receiving core. I think they are a better football team than the BC Lions overall. But I'll tell you what, I do not count BC out of this game at all. And for a team that lost by 31 2 weeks ago in a game that had huge playoff implications, to be just a 3-point favorite in this game, or a 3-point underdog, I should say, it certainly tells me that the bookmakers are thinking that this game is very much up for grabs. It's just amazing. I mean, the Riders went from thinking that they had the week off and are sitting back hosting the West Final to now having to deal with a very different looking team that they dispatched 2 weeks ago. I cannot wait for this game. And I'll tell you what, I think this game, I don't know if you maybe don't feel the same way, I think this game is going to be a game that we'll all be glued to the tube in the fourth quarter to see what happens.
That could very well be the case, and I could certainly eat some crow after my assessment. I disagree with you. I think that the Riders punched BC Lions in the mouth and end what has been a really weird season in Vancouver. I think there will be some added motivation for the BC Lions, obviously with the Grey Cup being in their backyard. I do wonder what having the bye week on the last week of the regular season for the BC Lions will do for this game. I know that the Riders were able to kind of have a last-minute reset of their roster, sitting 5 key players, I believe it was, but they still, we talked about this, Huss, the CFL, you don't have rosters big enough to sit everybody. So you have that wear and tear. So it's that rest versus rust argument. When I think about it, when I think about Riderville, when I think about how crazy Labor Day Classic was and the crowd was, I know they're having issues selling that stadium, which blows my mind right now. They're giving away tickets to corporations because they want to get a packed house. But regardless, I think it's going to be a tough area to play. We've talked about the BC Lions and having to come out to the prairies in November. The weather looks to be around 0. It's not cold to you and I, Huss, or to people in Saskatchewan, but talk to somebody in Vancouver about 0, and that is cold
Very fair.
As hell.
Very fair.
So they're not going to be playing in the comfortable confines of BC Place. I do like Vernon Adams. I think Vernon Adams, I voted for him as an all-star because I felt like he didn't play a lot, but he was a second choice. I felt like he was a guy who did enough in the time that he did to warrant kind of recognition. Also the West didn't exactly have a lot of quarterbacks throwing the lights out, but I just don't buy into Vernon Adams having this magical story. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that he's able to come in after being a front runner for MOP, sitting down for 8 games and then coming back and leading his BC Lions to a Grey Cup. That would be a magical story. I'd be all for that in Grey Cup week. I just don't think Vernon Adams is capable of doing it with this team. I just don't think he is. I don't think the Lions are good enough. I don't think they're mentally strong enough. I've talked about, these things in the past. I think how the team and the players, including, handled the Nathan Rourke stuff, I just see that as whatever. And as far as Vernon Adams goes, Huss, 27-3 against a Montreal Alouettes team that had no interest in flying out to Vancouver on a short week in a nothing game, that Vernon Adams put up, a lot early on, not so much as the game wrapped up. I don't think he was all that amazing, to be honest with you. I don't think that Alouettes defense was as strong as they would be in an otherwise situation. And I just think that the Riders are playing their best football right now. So add up all those things. I don't think we'll be glued to the TV in the final moments of that game. I think we'll be watching Nathan Rourke finish it.
Oh, wow. Well, we are on different sides of the fence. We'll bet a beer on this one. And because, as I said, strange things happen in the playoffs in the Canadian Football League. And it's not like we haven't seen BC play at a high level. We know that it is there. We just haven't seen it very much. And, you do make a good point. I mean, that game was everything for BC, everything for Vernon Adams, not so much for Montreal. That won't be the case when they kick off on Saturday at Mosaic with the Riders. I do expect it to be Bombers Riders, and what an amazing, I think back to that West Final a few years ago it was the December game. That was a very memorable one. But either way, whoever comes to Winnipeg, it's going to be a hell of a game on November 9th here in the Peg, and the Montreal Alouettes will be facing either the Argos or the Red Blacks. I do expect we've got a rematch of last year's East Final where the Argos were the big favorite, and it was the visiting Alouettes that ended up getting the win. Great show, Hammer. Bring on the playoffs. Huge thanks again to Garage Living Winnipeg, the sponsor of CFL 110. This is your chance, gang, to clear the clutter, revolutionize your garage, organize and beautify it with slat wall polyaspartic floor coating, made in Canada premium metal cabinetry. Check out their website and all their amazing work at garageliving.com, and give Pat Kanuga a call at 204-999-1234 to book a free in-garage consultation or make an appointment to meet him at their showroom at 981 Main Street. For Garage Living Winnipeg, for Jeff Hamilton, I'm Andrew Paterson. Enjoy the East and West semis, folks. And we'll see you next week on CFL 110, getting ready for November 9th. Montreal and Winnipeg will be the venues. 4 teams remaining for a trip to the Grey Cup. Have a great one, and thanks for being with us on CFL 110.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.